Listeners to Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast, can support conservation efforts in the Great Plains by liking, following, subscribing, and reviewing the podcast. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review to help support our on-the-ground conservation efforts and our education, training, and mentorship programs.
Welcome to Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast. Funding for this series has been provided by a generous grant from the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. In this brief introduction, we want to give you a taste of what you're in for here. I am your host, Dr. Josh Anderson. I was raised in rural North Dakota, in a small town along the banks of the Park River, a tributary of the Red River, which marks the border between North Dakota and Minnesota. It is a region known as the Red River Valley, named for the reddish-brown silt that gives the river its red hue. After years as a bulldozer operator, truck driver, and farmhand throughout the Great Plains, I earned my PhD in American Literature from The Ohio State University in 2018. Until the winter of 2023, I was a professor of English at a university in West Hartford, Connecticut. I was raised on stories told around kitchen tables and dusty pickup cabs and gravel pits and wheat fields. In Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast, we share this style of storytelling with you, our listeners. Whenever possible, our interviews take place out in the grasslands, the tree rows, the fields, and the pastures. We take you to the sounds of the prairie, the lilting melodies of the western meadowlark, and the rush of North Dakota wind through the prairie grass. We share the stories of people working to preserve and protect soil, water, and grassland habitats. We share stories that teach us about our histories and seek multiple pathways to finding common ground. Although this podcast focuses on the farms, ranches, and prairies of the northern Great Plains, let me start with a story from my time as a professor in New England, which offers one of many points of origin for Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast. My campus office was less than 2 miles west of Mark Twain's mansion in the historic Nook Farm neighborhood of Hartford, Connecticut. In Twain's backyard trickled a little river, once known as the Hog River, due to the prominent pork industry along its banks. The little river was later renamed the Park River, a tributary of the Connecticut. It was while living on the banks of this Park River that Twain wrote some of his most iconic books, such as Life on the Mississippi and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, works that vividly depict the Mississippi River, even though Twain was far removed from the waters of his boyhood. I have become obsessed with the strange coincidences that brought me nearly 1,300 miles away from my hometown of Park River, North Dakota, only to find myself for a time teaching literature down the road from Twain's mansion in Hartford's Park River watershed. One of my favorite lessons was to take my students to the manicured lawns of the Mark Twain House and Museum, where we would read his essay, 2 Ways of Seeing a River. The piece was not originally published as a standalone essay. Instead, it first appeared as part of a serialized installment in the Atlantic Monthly, which would later be collected in Life on the Mississippi. The 3-paragraph essay that has become known as 2 Ways of Seeing a River begins with Twain's boyhood reflections on the magic, poetry, and unobstructed splendor of a sunset catching in the muddy waters of the Mississippi. The second paragraph considers the same scene, sunset on the Mississippi, but shifts to Twain's perspective after years as a grizzled riverboat pilot, where he learned to see danger and economic despair lurking in every eddy and hiding around every bend in the river as it elbowed its way through the middle of the country. In the final paragraph, Twain measures whether he has gained or lost most by learning his trade, wondering if by learning to see the river as a riverboat captain, he had lost the poetic view of his boyhood. My students contemplated this question for themselves while standing on Twain's lawn, looking down upon the parking lot behind Twain's house. When their reflective murmurs quieted, I asked if they could see the Park River from where they stood, asked them to point out the river they had seen flowing in old pictures of Twain's house during the tour of his mansion. "Where is it?" a student asked. "Where's the river?" "Yes," I answered. "Where is it?" It's a question that doesn't have easy answers. I have found that the best way to answer tough questions is to tell a story. The story of the Park River in Hartford takes us back to the 1940s, when city officials elected to bury the river under the city to help prevent annual flooding and to mitigate pollution. We could even track this story back to the 19th century, when Samuel Colt built his manufacturing works in Hartford on the banks of the Connecticut River, which he rerouted to protect his profitable Colt revolver factory from floods. The story continues today when we ask how these choices in the past have affected us in the present. Today, Twain's Two Ways of Seeing a River offers us an opportunity to consider the many ways we learn to not see a river. Now that I am working in soil and water conservation in my home county in rural North Dakota, I have learned that there are many more than two ways to see a river, and perhaps just as many ways to unsee it. This podcast raises simple questions that do not have easy answers. What can we learn from the prairie? What can we learn from our own human histories? In a podcast rooted in stories and ideas from a particular place, perhaps our most important question is, where are we? To live in North Dakota is to live in the least visited state in the lower 48. It is a beautiful landscape, rich with stories, and it is a place often referred to as flyover country. In Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast, we bring you home to this prairie landscape, where you can learn from the toughness, beauty, and patience of one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth. Our hope is that it will also reach our neighbors, people who live side by side, often for generations, and who have a vested interest in the choices we make today in our conservation efforts. Perhaps most of all, Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast, is rooted in our effort to learn from the prairie ecosystem, as well as the human histories that have shaped and continue to shape the place we call home. In the winter of 2023, I left my campus office in West Hartford, Connecticut, and returned home to the prairie. Friends of mine know that whenever I felt homesick while studying literature in Columbus, Ohio, and Logan, Utah, or out somewhere on the road working wage labor jobs in places like Corn, Oklahoma, and Deerfield, Kansas, my mom would send sound recordings of the cottonwood leaves rattling in the west pasture and wind rushing through the prairie grass. The sound of North Dakota wind reminds me of my grandmother, who battled severe homesickness most of her life. Raised on the red soils of Oklahoma, Grandma and her family were displaced during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s to the fruit plantations of California, where her father, my great-grandfather, became a Baptist tent preacher, famous for delivering apocalyptic sermons filled with images of hellfire under the shade of orange trees. This podcast is not a platform for sermons. Instead, it takes inspiration from the prairie, a region and an ecosystem that is perhaps our best example of a literal common ground. This podcast is indebted to my grandmother's stories of survival and adaptation. It is inspired by a love of place and the crushing sorrow of homesickness. But perhaps you're wondering, what does common ground mean to us? Before Abraham Lincoln was president, he delivered an impassioned speech he called A House Divided. Best remembered for his powerful metaphor for the fractured nation as a house divided against itself on the moral and political consequences of slavery, the speech continues to resonate for many Americans today. Common Ground, a Prairie podcast, is inspired by Lincoln's speech, less for its metaphor than for its simple, clear opening line. As Lincoln says, quote, "If we can first know where we are and whither we are tending, we can then better judge what to do and how to do it." Common Ground, for better or worse, is our attempt to return the conversation to that first question: where are we? To answer this question, we have traveled across North Dakota to interview people with uncommon love for the land, water, and wildlife of the Northern Great Plains. Our first episode features an interview with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and bird enthusiast Mike Jacobs, who spoke with us on the shores of Kelly's Slough National Wildlife Refuge. In episode 2, we take you to Bismarck to visit with Heather Husband of the North Dakota Meadowlark Initiative, to Valley City to meet Jody Provost of the North American Grouse Partnership, and to Wildflower Grove in Fargo to talk with Amanda Boer of the Audubon Great Plains. Throughout the series, we speak with other incredible guests. We talk with researchers from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center and the University of North Dakota Wildlife Lab. We check in with my friends at the Land Institute in Kansas and the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality. We speak with soil health specialist Naeem Kalwar about his passion for soil, which began in his home village in Pakistan and continues today at his office at the Langdon, North Dakota Research Extension Center. Most importantly, we talk with local people, farmers, ranchers, fishermen, and hunters. The stories we share are as diverse as the prairie, and often just as beautiful and full of wonder. Before we go, take a listen for yourself. We've put together a sample for you. We hope it will inspire you to stick around a while. Until next time, thank you for listening to Common Ground, a Prairie podcast.
Well, fire is the biggest key. No fire, no prairie. We could say that in every single segment of an interview, right? No fire, no prairie.
To me, if you have access to livestock, you should plant full season cover crop. You should include them in your rotation. We have a short growing season. Then you're going to see what kind of a growth you could get. And you'll get your dollars back in the first year.
As I feel very strongly for myself and my students, you need to visit a prairie landscape more than once, just allow that dramatic dynamic to seep into you. And so the seasonal dynamic, but also daily swings. I always tell my students, we have an inside to go to. These plants, these animals, they don't. It could be, 30 below. It could be 105. It could be humid. It could be dry. Maybe they got burned. Maybe there's a drought. But they're there and they're enduring and they are interacting and creating a healthy ecosystem.
Most people don't carry a spade in their pickup to go out there and look.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see that you got worms life. You got worms out there. You got that life. That would be one of the indications that you've got biology in your soil.
Yeah.
You got the worms.
Yeah.
I know my uncle he was just tickled to see that he's getting worms back in his soil again.
My most important lesson from the prairie, I would say establish deep roots, diversity inspires beauty, and have quiet, persistent patience.
I thought this was a great question, and I spent quite a lot of time thinking about it. So, my symphony would open with sharp-tailed grouse drumming, and they would soon be joined by 1.5 million geese calling, and the geese would quiet down, and the robins would start calling, and then we would have a little bit of an interlude where the prairie sparrows would be buzzing around. And then, getting towards sunset, the meadowlarks would take over. And they would really steal the show. And then, just as the meadowlark chorus was quieting down, the crows would come, cawing, and we would fade out with a great horned owl.
My love of stories is indebted to the literature that continues to shape and reshape my understanding of the place I call home. My all-time favorite novel is Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich, a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa and a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer from North Dakota. Love Medicine inspired me to become a writer from the opening sentence. The national bestseller Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, an enrolled member of the Potawatomi Nation, invited me to see land, stories, and communities as a braided relationship. And works by Lakota poet Layli Long Soldier, Dakota writer Susan Power, and Blackfeet writer Stephen Graham Jones continue to challenge the way I see the prairie as home to deep and ongoing Indigenous histories and a place that invites and adopts new stories, from Powers and Jones's references to Star Wars, to Long Soldier's present tense remembering of the Dakota Wars. There are so many other stories always in the braid. I cannot drive home without thinking of Steve Buscemi in the Coen brothers' Fargo, and I cannot see a hummingbird or a Canada goose without thinking of my Grandma Velma and my Grandpa Ray. This podcast is a labor of love and the product of a team effort. Thanks to Anthony Butler for the sound editing on each episode, which helps to bring to life the voices of our invited guests and the unexpected voices of the prairie landscape. Thanks to my talented friend Matthew Connolly for producing our theme music mixed with prairie birdsong. Special thanks to Brandon Mathiasen, the business operations manager here at our Walsh County Conservation District, without whom this podcast would not be possible. Thanks also to Heather Husband of the North Dakota Meadowlark Initiative for helping us to get the word out to conservation organizations throughout the region and for appearing as a guest herself in episode 2. The beautiful mural of a western meadowlark that appears on our Spotify page was painted by Melody Alt of the Bareface Studio in Grafton, North Dakota. Thanks to our crew members Taylor Lorenz, Heather Okeson, Thomas Fuentes, Gracie Biryanic, Libby Stuckaluk, Norris Severtson, and all future crew members who help us bring this podcast to you. Thanks to Lori Zaradka, Molly Zaradka, Mike Hansen, Callahan Lamar, and all the folks at the North Valley Career and Technology Center in Grafton for encouraging young people to work with us here at the Walsh County Three Rivers Conservation District. Thanks to all of our guests this season. We look forward to sharing their stories here each month throughout 2024. And finally, a very special thanks to you, our listeners.
Listeners to Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast, can support conservation efforts in the Great Plains by liking, following, subscribing, and reviewing the podcast. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review to help support our on-the-ground conservation efforts and our education, training, and mentorship programs.